Welcome back to the Click Down. As always, I'm your host, Steve Beals, and today we're going to discuss Citrix on Nutanix, a topic near and dear to my guest today, Paul Murray. Paul, welcome to the Click Down.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
We'll talk
thanks
about
for being here.
engineering stuff in a minute. Yeah.
so before we start diving into some of the questions I have, I always have our guests give a little background on themselves and what you've done in your career and what you do here at Citrix.
Okay. All right, so I've. Where do I start? I guess I started at Citrix about 25 years ago. So it was late 90s. I started as a system engineer in Switzerland and then moved on to what was then called the Tech Readiness Team. So based out of Schaffhausen in the then headquarters. I moved into product marketing initially. I think about sort of 16 years into the tenure at Citrix.
Mm-hmm.
And then for some reason I thought, I've had enough of this. I'm leaving. Not quite as brutal as that, but then I left Citrix and went to work at Nutanix for 5 years. So I was at Nutanix as an SE in southern Sweden, and then moved into the channel for the Nordics, and then what Nutanix called a solutions architect for EUC. So did that for a couple of years in Nutanix, and then sort of thought, had enough of this as well, and went back to Citrix. So, I mean, I've been around the Citrix. Sorry?
I said they always pull you back in. I'm a rebounder.
Yeah, I know.
Well,
so, I mean, it's sort of been around the Citrix Nutanix world for, I guess, 20 years of Citrix and 5 years of Nutanix.
Awesome.
That's me.
Awesome. Yeah, it's funny. I know a lot of people who've left and come back. Like I said, myself being one of them. It's
the boomerang kids.
Yeah, you gotta love the boomerangers. So, so I want to start out today by really just talking a little bit about the high level architecture of Citrix on Nutanix, and really the question I have is what makes Nutanix the ideal platform for Citrix workloads.
So this is what I always used to say to customers as well. It really is the simplicity of the platform that Nutanix has, the architecture Nutanix has. Now, without being derogatory or not trying to simplify it too much, I mean, the platform does do a lot of very clever stuff. But I think what's important for the Citrix world is the way it essentially presents local storage back to the virtual machines. So your use the old words, your Zen app servers, your CVAD servers. If you looked at the world without Nutanix, I mean, I remember when I used to work at the Tech Readiness Team, we used to talk about designing the better solution, and you talk about local storage, and then you get to the point where you need to scale away or scale up from single servers. So you start talking about shared storage. Mm-hmm. And that's when it introduced things such as SAN networks, storage networks, and the like. Now, they work. Of course they work. I mean, the industry's used them for many, many years, but it's an additional layer between the virtual machine and the storage and all the compute stuff. So I guess the most simplistic way of sort of describing Nutanix is they have a distributed storage fabric between all these nodes. There's a component called the controller virtual machine, and the controller virtual machine essentially presents local storage back to the virtual machine that is running your Zen app workloads or your CVAD workloads. So you're always going to get the best performance because you're never going to get better than local storage performance. So if that's running on SSD, your CVAD instances, they're essentially running on local SSD. So that's Nutanix in a nutshell. It then enables things such as shadow clones. So again, if you think of the concept or you think of the construct, you've got I'll stay with 5 nodes, 5 physical nodes. Mm-hmm. You have 5 physical Nutanix nodes. The local storage that is attached to those local nodes, that creates this storage fabric. When a virtual machine on node 1, for example, starts, it starts to read the data from local disk. So any read-write activity that the CVAD server uses, it reads locally, it writes locally. There's a concept of a replication factor, which we won't go into right now. It's basically for resiliency. But how shadow clones works is essentially it's a caching mechanism, if you want. The guys from Nutanix don't like that wording, but as virtual machines on additional physical hosts start up, they need to read their data. So they're going to go to the master image. They're going to drag that across the network. And what they then do in the Nutanix world is they will persist that locally on that locally attached storage. So the next or the subsequent virtual machines that start on node 2 or node 3, they're always going to be using local storage. So again, over time, it's essentially it's always going to use local storage. Now, I know in the Citrix world, there's a concept of MCSO write cache, or the provisioning service of write cache, or IntelliCache as it used to be. It's a similar concept. It's part of the way Nutanix works. So there's nothing that you need to install and nothing you need to enable. It's there by default. It's essentially their architecture. And you take that a step further, when you're talking about the performance, is as you want to scale out these things, that replication factor that I talked about, as the word sort of suggests, it's a copy or a replica of data that is written that is stored somewhere within the Nutanix cluster that's going to enable or simplify your HA, your disaster recovery storage, your disaster recovery scenarios. So again, I know I got told off for this at Nutanix. They're not a storage company. Mm-hmm. It's the thing that Nutanix changes. Storage is the thing that Nutanix has changed in the data center. And storage is one of the things is where you see most performance impact in the Citrix world. If the storage doesn't work, it's slow.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I remember when Nutanix first came out, and that was like, I feel like that was the big push, right? I mean, the word hyperconverged and everything else, having it all in one, but I remember the storage being the main driver there, and working with some customers who were moving to that, and that was for them was a big driver for them. You mentioned MCS before, and when you mentioned that, it made me think, like, when because of the similar type architecture, what they do is do we see any performance benefits when customers are using MCS on Nutanix, or is it just because it's there and it works, and we don't really see numbers, or is it something we really haven't tested?
So I think you see significant improvements. I think the best way of describing it is not just the performance improvements, but also the linearity, mm-hmm. but also the predictable linearity. So, I mean, I think the best way of describing that is as you scale from a few nodes to hundreds of nodes, again, because the architecture, because it's this storage fabric or distributed storage fabric, as an admin, you've got, you're not going to say guarantee, but you've got a better feeling or a better understanding that as you add more nodes into the cluster, that you're not going to negatively impact the performance.
Right. Okay.
It's always going to be predictable. So if your WinWords, if your Outlooks have got a response time of, just call it a second as a round number, then as you scale from a dozen nodes to hundreds of nodes in those multiple clusters, then your users are going to see a predictable, linear, same experience.
Makes sense. So I've heard Nutanix, mention one-click operations. What exactly is that? And really, like, how does that help or even relate to a Citrix environment?
It's marketing. So it is marketing. It's a marketing story. It's a very powerful marketing story. And I mean, without being stupid or cheeky or whatever, it's essentially what it means. It's one-click operations. Now, I know there is nothing in the IT world that is a single click. But what they mean with one-click operations is a reduced interactivity in terms or on the side of the admin. So take an example of disaster recovery. So with disaster recovery, in a non-Nutanix world, you need to create your volume groups. You need to create your protection domains. You need to create which instances you want to protect. You need to define where to protect to. You need to define the different schedules. You need to go to talk to the network admins. Can you create me these volume groups and stuff like that? I SCSI adapters, and it works, but it takes a big effort to get it configured.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the one-click operations, what Nutanix means by that is that their management console, or their management concept, is a thing called Prism. So each node has a thing called Prism element. A set of nodes which defines a cluster has the ability to connect to a Prism Central. Essentially, it's the same sort of management interface. So it's an HTML5 based web console. And if you go back to the example of disaster recovery, what they mean with one-click operations is it's very simple to create a disaster recovery environment. The way I always used to talk about this in Nutanix was you create three things. You create what you want to protect. So that's your application group, your servers, your whatever infrastructure. You create when you want to protect it. So your schedule, whether it is every day, whether it is once a week, once a month. And then you create where you want to protect it to.
Mm-hmm.
So where it can be protected to is another physical cluster. You can connect it to the cloud or whatever. So essentially in Prism, okay, it's 3 clicks in this case. With fewer clicks, you created what you want to protect, when you want to protect it, and where you want to protect it to. And as soon as you click OK, it's now protecting that protection domain. So as soon as you click OK, it's gone off and created snapshots. It's going to replicate those snapshots to that protection to that remote cluster. And okay, for a few XenApp servers or CVAD servers or your infrastructure servers, that environment is protected within 15, 20 minutes.
Wow. Okay.
And then when you want to disaster recovery, you can do that manually. So you can do a failover. And because the data is already on your remote node, all it really needs to do is to spin them up. If you've got multiple clusters, if you look at image management, for example, so the problem of managing multiple master images becomes a lot easier with the disaster recovery concept of Nutanix. So you create your master image, you can replicate that to multiple back-end clusters, and then you bring those master images online, and those master images are now available for your virtual machines or for your infrastructure on those remote clusters. So it just makes the daily management a lot easier in the Nutanix world. So I mean, that's how I sort of describe the one-click.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds simple enough. Yeah, but I mean, it does sound simple enough. And you know, when you think about even in disaster recovery scenarios, I mean, with you know, not only like server wise, but like storage wise, with like profiles and everything else, it just seems like it would be, you know, a very simple process to spin things up if needed, if you're in a disaster situation.
Yeah, so that's the tip of the iceberg, to be honest. Again, it's one of the reasons why I always said Nutanix is a storage company, because they change the way storage works. Now, if you look at the stack involved in Citrix, so you've got your CVAD servers, you have your applications, you have application layering, you mentioned the profiles, printers. If you separate them all out into different layers, then you can manage each of those layers individually. And you can apply things like HA or business continuity or disaster recovery to the whole stack or components within that stack.
Right.
So this ability to be able to, if you want, encapsulate the pieces of the CVAD stack into little buckets and then transport those buckets to wherever you want to, opens up a lot of possibilities. I mean, we can talk about those in a few minutes when we talk about cloud clusters and stuff like that. But I guess the simplest way is that they've broken storage down into, it's not a technical term, buckets.
Mm-hmm.
And you can take those buckets wherever they need to be.
Yeah, it kind of breaks it down pretty easy. I mean, that makes sense. You know, the bucket analogy makes sense. You mentioned shadow clones earlier. What exactly are they? And you know, how if I'm new to Nutanix, how does that help me?
Okay, so let me try and slow down a bit. So I guess the best way to describe it, there's nothing wrong in saying it. It's essentially it's a cached copy
Mm-hmm.
of the data that the VM, the Windows 10, Windows 11, or Server 2022 virtual machine needs to run at that point in time. Now, what I mean by that, so if you mentioned MCS earlier, so if you look at the way MCS works, you're going to create your master image, you're going to provision 10 virtual machines, the boot process kicks in, it's going to read from that master image. There's an identity disk in there, and as that virtual machine is read, it's going to store the data in. It's going to store the data, or it's going to store the data in memory on the virtual machine. It's going to want to write data to the difference disk. So that's sort of essentially how machine creation service works.
Yep.
So Nutanix doesn't change the way MCS works. What Shadow Clones does is, instead of the virtual machines always having to go across the network to the storage where the master image resides, as a virtual machine boots up on remote nodes, the controller virtual machine, so the CVM, the heart of Nutanix, is going to detect that, and then it's going to start building, if you want, this cache of the master image. So node 1, 2, 3 through to 10, over time, they're going to have a local cache of the data that has been read by the virtual machines running on those remote nodes. So you've got your original master image on node 1, and like I said, as the virtual machines are booted up across the cluster over time, you're going to essentially build a cache of the master image. So you don't cache the whole or the complete master image. So if your Win10 image is 10 gig or 15 gig, we're not going to cache 15 gigabytes of data. It's just the stuff that is required as the users have launched their applications. So the benefit of that is, the stuff that is always going to be cached is the sort of Windows operating system. So Win32, stuff like that, the boot processes. So as subsequent virtual machines start up on those nodes, they don't need to go to the original master image. They're going to use this shadow clone to start up. Now, what that means in terms of performance is the boot time for those virtual machines is significantly reduced. The logon time for those virtual machines is, I'll say significantly without having numbers in front of me, is also significantly reduced. Why? Very simply, because it doesn't have to go across the network to get all the data.
Right.
Now, I know this is a Citrix on Nutanix. I'll say it out loud. It also works with VMware. So it's not a Citrix-specific technology. Again, it's the way the Nutanix architecture works. Is we create, or they keep the data local to the virtual machine. So if that virtual machine then moves to node 2, node 3, over time, we're going to rebuild that concept of shadow clone for that virtual machine. So if you want, I don't think I've ever explained it like this. It's follow me data. If you want, the data
that makes
follows
sense.
the virtual machine.
Yeah, it seems like it allows that expansion to happen, right? If I need to expand out my cluster, it's not going to degrade any performance, and users aren't going to see any impact, and it really just seems like it's best of both worlds there. So, thinking about you mentioned cloud before, and question around how Nutanix can help build out. We keep hearing the hybrid and multi-cloud, and that's out there right now. How does Nutanix help build this hybrid multi-cloud that we keep hearing about?
So how open can I be? Sorry, Nutanix, you're not going to like this. No, being serious. So how do I say this politically correctly? So a difficulty, not a problem. Not allowed to say problems. So again, when I was there, when I used to work there, I mean, the way we used to talk about the Nutanix architecture was enterprise cloud. So it's essentially bringing the cloud idea into on-premise solutions.
Mm-hmm.
I think they realized fairly quickly that the cloud, or the world, is going cloud. I think the world has realized fairly quickly that it's a bad mistake. We want to go back to on-prem. Different story. But
that's another episode, Paul.
Yeah. Okay. I think Nutanix sort of realized, okay, we need to take this on-prem solution and make that cloud aware or cloud friendly, put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So the concept of Nutanix clusters, so this construct, your nodes, they build, like I said, what is called a Nutanix cluster. Nutanix cloud clusters is nothing other than a Nutanix cluster in the cloud on bare metal instances. So if you imagine you've built your Nutanix cluster on your Dell whatevers in your data center, the same sort of construct, the same sort of architecture applies to Nutanix cloud clusters. So you build a Nutanix cluster on bare metal AWS or Azure instances, and then you essentially spin up your Nutanix cluster in the cloud. Now, people or customers back then, they'd say, so why do you want to do this? Why do you want to take all that simplicity that you've brought into your data center and then put it into the cloud where I've got no control over what I'm doing? That's where the story actually becomes extremely powerful, because you've built your Nutanix cluster on-prem. You can go ahead and use exactly the same tools. So there's a tool called Foundation, which sets up that cluster. That's going to create your Nutanix cluster on bare metal AWS. One of the big benefits there is you can just hibernate that. So as soon as you hibernate your entire cluster. So if you think about it, you've got a 10-node cluster. It's doing its job. You don't need it for a certain amount of time. You don't need to break it down. You just hibernate it.
Mm-hmm.
So it converts, so it starts to use S3 storage, which is a lot cheaper. If you want to spin it back up, excuse me, if you want to spin it back up, it's going to spin that cluster back up on AWS bare metal. Now, the benefit of that is, first of all, you have two individual clusters. The first thing people will suggest or state then is, but doesn't that mean I have two instances to manage? That's where Prism Central comes in. So Prism Central is the management console, management concept. It doesn't matter if you're managing one cluster, two clusters, 10 clusters. Prism Central can talk to those different clusters, whether it's on-prem or off-prem, or on-prem or cloud-based.
Okay.
So you manage your cluster and you say, I want to spin up 10 virtual machines. You say where you want to spin them up, whether it's on-prem or off-prem. Or if you think about the concept of Cloudburst, so tie this into the Citrix world with Cloudburst and Autoscale.
Yep. That was going to be a follow-up question I had.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, perfect.
Sorry. So you spin up your CVED stuff on-prem. End of the month comes around, or Christmas comes around, or Black Friday comes around. People go crazy shopping. You haven't got enough resources. What does it do? It spins up that hibernated NC2 cluster, auto-scales it, so it powers on those virtual machines that are now cloud-based. The other benefit behind that is you don't need to change anything. There's no difference between the CVAD instance running on-prem or running in the cloud. So there's no transformation between those virtual images.
Right.
You take your single master image. So go back to the one-click story. You take your single master image, and then you want to use that to provision virtual machines on the cloud. You just use this cloud, the Prism Central concept. You essentially disaster recovery your master image to your cloud cluster instance, provision those virtual machines, add them as part of the delivery group. And then when Autoscale kicks in, it knows, okay, I need to go and spin up those virtual machines that are cloud-based. It'll go off and do those, and you've got your capacity.
Awesome. So one other follow-up question. You mentioned AWS and Azure. Does Nutanix have the same offering in other clouds? Google, because obviously with Citrix, we support multiple clouds. Where does it lie there?
So I don't think they do. I would need to double check whether it's never going to happen. What I do know is the networking on GCP is different, or is different enough to make it a longer journey, if you want to use those words, a longer journey to get it running on GCP. And again, I used to work there. That was the reason why they did it on AWS, first of all. They had the tie-ins to AWS, then they went to Azure. And I don't know, maybe it's cynical, but I always use that example for the hybrid cloud world. So if you look at the way applications evolve in a company, some will start on AWS, some will start on Azure.
Yep.
One of the reasons why is that the development team understands Azure. So they start developing on Azure. And then that application becomes important. Then you get another application, could be AWS based. And all of a sudden, you're multi-cloud.
Yep.
Whether you designed it or not, you're multi-cloud.
Makes sense. So unfortunately, we're just about out of time. But as we're talking, I feel like there might even be a part 2 to this conversation. So it seems like there's a lot more we can dive into. So I'm hoping you'll come back in a future episode.
Love to.
Yeah. But before we sign off, I know you've given a lot of presentations and at shows and at CUGCs. Are there any of those available that we can point people to online, so that if they're looking for more information?
Of me?
Yeah.
No. Jesus, no. Oh, now you put me on the spot. So there's a couple of blogs that I've posted recently. Officially, there's a few webinars from Citrix and Nutanix. So there's one that I did recently with Sean Donahue. If I do not know the title.
Okay.
There's another one that I did with Kees Bakkerman and his team. So we've done 2 or 3 of those this year. And yeah, there's some very, very old Zen desktop.
So we can have people Google Paul Murray, Nutanix, Citrix, and something will come up.
Hopefully, I don't know.
We'll find out. But no, I really appreciate you joining today, Paul. It was a great conversation, and I do look forward to hearing more. And for everyone else, thank you for joining today. And as always, thanks for listening. This has been the ClickDown.